Guys, hips can be crazy. And I just don't think that we give them enough airtime, to be perfectly honest. You hear all the time about stifles and hocks and elbows and shoulder dysfunction, all that sort of stuff. They are very dysfunctional joints most of the time, don't get me wrong. But the hip is such an integral part of movement in the hind end. If you don't have good hip health, if you don't have a horse that can balance and load into their hips, you don't really have a whole lot. And the thing is that the hip joint can be compromised really easily if you have a front end dysfunction as well. If a horse is leaning into their front end and kind of hinging or hanging off of their sacroiliac, their SI, in that lumbar lower back kind of region, then generally speaking, you're going to have a horse that doesn't load into their hips correctly, right? So why do we not talk more about hip health and the hips of our horses? They seem to be a bit of a forgotten joint. Now, the thing is, hips are really hard to image. They sit really deep underneath a lot of muscle in the horse's hindquarters. So this is the acetabulum. We're looking at the horse's pelvis. The head is that way. The tail is this way. The tail sits just right here, actually. And the hip itself here sits under a very large muscle mass. Just because we can't diagnostically image it easily doesn't mean that we can't see how the hip moves and how the hip is loaded into in the body of the horse as they're moving, even just as they're grazing or as they're walking around. We can see that because we can see it in the balance of the pelvis. We can see it in the way that they want to kind of pop their hips sometimes or not drop and load into a hip itself. So first, before we get into any more detail, I want to show you what the hip joint actually looks like and how it works, right? So as I've said, the hip itself sits a little bit further back than most people anticipate. I think this is probably because we're taught that this part of the pelvis is the point of hip, right? Anatomically speaking, I remember being taught this as the point of hip, but as you can see with the hip joint here, this bone actually has nothing really to do with the movement of the hip. Sure, it does have a relationship to the hip because there are a lot of muscles that attach from here over to the hip, or they work in relationship with each other, the muscles attaching these two together. But this is not a movable joint. This is not a joint at all. As you can see, it is a bony part of the pelvis, right? So it should be an incredibly stable part of the horse's body. It's not a movable joint. So while this is the point of hip, fancy name, tubercoxy for those playing at home, but your hip joint is a lot further back in the body of the horse. There are two bones that play a part in the hip joint. Don't worry, there's just gale force winds blowing here. You have your femur and your pelvis. They're the two bones that create the hip joint. Now, as those two sit in together, there is an incredibly strong ligament that holds the two together where my thumb is there, and that creates stability between those two bones and allows for a lot of motion, right? It's a ball and socket joint, and so it is able to create flexion extension to move the leg forward and backwards as the horse is moving. It allows for adduction and abduction. So, adduction and abduction, placing the leg underneath the horse and placing the leg away, and then a little bit of rotation as well, right? So rotating the limb inward and rotating the limb outward. Because of all the soft tissue that hold these two bones together, the range of motion in this joint is a little less than what I'm able to show you here now. But that's the joy of having just the bones. We can dramatically see what the range of motion is. And you can go back to your horse in the paddock and actually pick up their leg and have a play with what the range of motion truly is in their hip joint. You'll see that it's not quite as dramatic as I can show you here. So we have these two bones involved in this joint. We then have, as I said, your accessory ligament that holds the two bones together in place. We have a synovial joint around there, which just means that there is a joint capsule around these two bones that holds synovial fluid inside. Synovial fluid pretty much just keeps the joint lubricated. Now you can have very healthy synovial fluid, you can have inflamed or unhealthy synovial fluid. Same thing with your joint capsule, with your ligaments, with all of the muscle. You have a range of health to dysfunction in all of these structures. You've also got, as I said before, a huge muscle mass that sits over the top of this joint that connects into the pelvis and connects to the femur, joins these two together and aid in locomotion, right? So these are the muscles that make the hip joint work, that make the hind limb move so that the horse can move forwards or backwards. Now, there are a lot of them. I could go through them for you if you want me to, but I'm not going to. You are looking though at your glute, your gluteal. So your big medial gluteal, you've got your smaller muscles, your deep gluteal, you've got your gemelli muscles, obturator muscles, you've got your rectus femoris, you've got your biceps femoris over the top of this hip joint as well, not actually connecting into the joint itself, but such a major player in how the hip actually functions. So all of these hindquarter muscles play a part in the locomotion of that joint. Now, if any of these structures are working out of balance with each other, you're going to see some kind of dysfunction in the way that the hip moves, right? So it might be that the horse finds it difficult to sit into one hip, or that they walk a little bit like a supermodel and they'll pop a hip out. Rather than rolling straight over the hip joint through the stance phase, they'll actually roll out onto that hip and try and unload somewhere within that limb. Now, sometimes these issues can be incredibly subtle, right? Now with this big guy, if I can line it up with the camera properly, hopefully you'll be able to see that his acetabulum on the left and the right, they don't actually point in the same direction, right? Meaning that his hips were actually articulated onto his pelvis with a different orientation, which means probably that he would actually walk differently with each of his hips. And that's just the way he was, right? That's his bone structure. We have to take that into account, right? Sometimes the body's just weird. I'm pretty sure my body is quite weird. If I were to pare it back and have a look at my skeleton, it doesn't mean that it is a restrictive dysfunction. It doesn't mean that he shouldn't have done something or another, but it just gives us an understanding that sometimes we're actually dealing with a scaffolding that's not straight and not balanced. So sometimes, try as we might, there is only so much improvement that we can ask of the horse. So far in my experience, there's no such thing as a perfect horse. There's no such thing as perfect balance. So we're just trying to optimize the movement of the animal to whatever they have available to them. Now, sometimes horses get these big ideas with their body that what they're given to begin with isn't enough, and they're going to remodel. Now, this is probably the most dramatic example of remodeling that I have seen. Certainly the most dramatic example that I have in my skeleton crew. This is Toby. He has incredible arthritic change to both of his hip joints, right? I'm trying to show you at every angle here. I'll show you with Katie sitting on top here as well, so you can get, hopefully, a good idea of what it should be with Katie and what this horse has actually remodeled into, right? Now, he was 35 years old when he was put to sleep, and so this could have been happening over a very long time period. But what has happened is that he has remodeled so much through his acetabulum that the hip joint has changed orientation entirely. Rather than pointing out and down in this kind of direction, it is now off this way. I don't know how that would have affected him as he was moving, because I didn't know him as an alive horse. He was donated to me as a skeleton, already cleaned. But what we can see is that he also has arthritic changes to the heads of the femurs on both sides, okay? So this was not a one-sided issue, this was both sides. There were other arthritic changes throughout the rest of his body, but nothing quite as dramatic as these hips. What we can also see when we put those hips together and ask for full range of motion, like we did with Katie, if I ask him for flexion and extension, I hit onto a blockage, coming forwards, I have backwards motion. If I ask for rotation, that is very clunky, it's very difficult to do and very limited. And when I ask for adduction and abduction, that's actually pretty good. That seems to be the best range of motion that he has. in moving the hind limb or moving the femur towards the body, so underneath himself and away from the body. Moving forwards and backwards, moving it forwards, we have strong limitation, and rotationally we have strong limitation as well. It begs a lot of questions for how this horse would have moved throughout the world, especially as he aged. But these are things that we could be dealing with on the inside of our horse's body, and we don't even know about it, right? This is, as I said, a very extreme presentation, and I can imagine that the movement patterns of this horse would have indicated strong restrictions to his hips while he was alive. Probably we would have been looking at extreme muscle wastage as well, considering that these arthritic changes here are placed where there are muscular attachments. Probably he wouldn't have had a whole lot of muscle development over his hindquarter. Going from one extreme to the other, healthy, lovely looking hips to rather dysfunctional looking hips, it can be a little bit confronting. So the question then becomes, what can we do? How can we find out about the health of our own horse's hips? And how do we keep a monitor on it? What I would say to you is just become the expert at your own horse. Watch them. Take videos of them. If you take a video from directly behind your horse, or a photo, both preferably, you can start to see whether you have muscular balance on the left side and the right side. You can see as they're walking forward whether they pop into one hip or the other, whether they drop one hip or they lift one hip. If you will start to see where there is balance and where there is consistency. Sometimes if you're working with a great trainer and you're working towards balance in your horse's body, you'll see these things change over time, which is why it is so valuable to take videos and to have these records, clogging up your phone memory. But to become an eagle eye on the body of your own horse is such a valuable tool, right? As I said earlier, you can lift up the hind leg of your horse. Obviously, do this from a very safe position. Please don't put yourself anywhere where you might get hurt. Lift their leg and then test for range of motion. Try and isolate just to the hip joint and very, very gently ask the leg to see if it can move in rotation, to see if it can move in adduction towards the body, in abduction away from the body. See where the limb gets stuck, and that might give you some indication of which muscles are tight or which ones don't want to move. Pair that together with actually watching your horse in motion, and you're going to start to really get a great image, potential image, of what's happening with the health of your horse's hips. So please do go and enjoy. I will be back next week with another body part, and a mysterious body part. If you enjoyed this today, I do have an online course going into more detail about the entire skeleton of the horse. I will link the website below. Otherwise, please go have fun with your horse. Give them a hug.